Yeah, gang, before we go a little bit further with levels of development and continue on with factfulness and our main man Hans, there's some key terms that I'm going to want you to note. So I'd like you to write down each of these key measures of development: GDP per capita, literacy rate, infant mortality rate, and life expectancy. And give yourself some room to jot down a few notes, because basically what we're going to be doing is we're going to be writing down these terms, getting a little definition. I'm also going to give you some extra info, so jot down some of the extra info. And then I'm also going to give you a good number for each of these terms. So, leave yourself a few lines for each of these terms, enough space for the definition and some extra notes and things like that. So you can go ahead and pause the video, and then I'll resume with definitions. All right, I'm back here. Our first term, gross domestic product. Gross domestic product. Key thing here with gross. Gross means total. It doesn't mean disgusting like green toenail fungus. That's gross. What we're talking about here is total. It's a word for total. Domestic, when we talk about domestic, look at the root word of domestic, or part of the word of domestic. You see the word dome. Dome rhymes with home. And so we're talking about home within our country, our home country, domestic affairs within the country, not foreign affairs outside of the country. And then product, well, product is just stuff. So we're talking about the total amount of stuff made. And the definition of gross domestic product, it's a way to measure a country's economy. It's a way to measure their economic output. And it's the total value of all goods and services produced in a country in a given year. All the stuff they make and all the services they provide. Me, myself, I don't make much. I mean, I'm making this video, but I don't make much for sale, right? I don't create things. Some folks create things and make things, and businesses do. Me, I provide a service. The service I provide, of course, is education and humor. Maybe, I don't know. That's debatable. But gross domestic product. So it's a way to measure the size of a country's economy. Total value of all goods and services produced in a country within a given year. So what can it tell us about a country? Well, again, if a country has a pretty good economy, we can make a lot of inferences about that country. If the economy is doing well, we can assume that most folks, but not all, but most folks are probably doing well. And so a country that has a high GDP, you could probably safely assume that the standard of living, the quality of life, the services in that country, the health in that country, you could assume that on average, on the whole, for most people, is pretty good, but not always, right? Conversely, if it's a pretty low number, you could infer the opposite. Again, not always, but we're making some inferences here. We're making some generalizations to learn about the world. And the question is, can it be misleading or deceiving? Yeah, absolutely it can be misleading or deceiving, right? Because a large country like the United States, one of the largest countries in the world, we should have one of the largest GDPs in the world just because we've got a huge population. And then even within that, GDP can be deceiving because not everyone is sitting on fat stacks of cash making it rain, right? So GDP is just one number, and it can give us a broad view, but it can't tell us everything. And so what is the United States GDP, you might be wondering? I want you to make a guess. I'm going to have you pause this video and guess a dollar amount. What is the GDP? In the year 2019, what is the total value of all the goods and services that we produced in the United States? Pause. And the answer is 19.4 trillion with a T. Holy cats. That is an incredibly large number. 19.4 trillion. Look at that. Oh, I'm covering up some of the zeros. Look at all those zeros, you guys. Those zeros, my goodness, that's so many zeros. That's so many numbers. We have a massive GDP, largest in the world. But again, we're also one of the largest countries in the world. So you would assume that we do. That's why it's important that we also look at GDP per capita. Per meaning each, and capita, think hat. Goes on your head, a cap, right? Per head. That's where it comes from, the Latin for per head. So GDP per capita is a way to normalize things a little bit, right? Because a country like the United States with 300 million compared to, say, a country with like 8 million, which country should have a larger overall economy? The country with over 300 million people should. But we got to look at it on an average level because we might have a very large economy in terms of a raw number, but maybe when you spread it out over a lot of people, it's a little bit less, right? Think of it like pizza. You might have a large pizza for you and 30 of your classmates, and your neighbor might have a small pizza for them and their friend. Who's going to probably get more pizza per person? Well, your neighbor and their friend who have a small pizza to split between the two of them. They're going to split the pizza two ways. Their little slice of the pie is going to be much bigger than you and your 30 classmates splitting a pizza 31 ways, All right, so let's take a look at this in terms of GDP per capita in the United States. We do the math, 19.4 trillion-ish divided by 300 billion-ish, and we get 59,500-ish. That's still a really good number, don't get me wrong. One point of clarification, GDP per person. That's not average income, that's not average salary. It doesn't mean the average person makes that. It's confused for that, and it can be approximated for that, but that's not quite what it means. So, again, GDP per capita, total value of all goods and services produced in a country within a given year. So what is a good number per capita? I don't know, man. Like, I just work here. I don't have all the answers, but I guess if you asked me what is a good number, and you did, I'd say anything above 35,000 is pretty good, right? That's pretty good. Anything above 35,000. Let's say 35,000. Yeah, that sounds good. So let's talk about GDP per capita. Let's take a look at two countries, Switzerland and China. Now, if we look at just population, right? Switzerland has a population of 8 million compared to China's 1.35 billion with a B. China is massive compared to Switzerland in terms of population. Let's look at their GDP. Well, lo and behold, 685 billion out of Switzerland, 12.24 trillion out of China. Who has a larger overall GDP? Well, of course, China does, right? It's twice as big based on raw numbers, but look at how many more people they have. So let's break it down per capita. Let's make it a fair fight and a fair comparison. And here we see GDP per capita for Switzerland, roughly 80,000 compared to 8,800 for China. So again, per capita is important as well. Who has the larger overall economy? China, 12.24 trillion. But on an individual level, whose economy is kind of better off on a per person level? Well, that would be Switzerland. And then we could also look at how that correlation between GDP per person and life expectancy. And we see Switzerland has a higher GDP per person, and they also happen to have a higher life expectancy. Oftentimes, those two numbers are linked. All right, speaking of life expectancy, on to our next one, the average age that a person may expect to live. Keep in mind, this is an average. Right? This is an average. I cannot stress enough that this is an average. We always like to talk about how back in the day that life expectancy was like 50 years. And that's pretty young. And does that mean that back in the day that when folks had their 50th birthday that they started croaking? No. Odds were if you lived to 50, you would definitely live to 60 and probably into your 70s and maybe even beyond, right? Because it was an average. And so you're going, okay, Mr. Kent, well, if the life expectancy is 50 and you're telling me that folks live to 70 or 80, square that circle. Well, it's math, right? And unfortunately, when you look at this statistic, the reason for a lower life expectancy typically is related to higher rates of death among children and infants. And we see in a lot of places where there is that lower life expectancy, or even just throughout history where there's that lower life expectancy, if you have a high percentage of your population dying before their 5th birthday, you're going to significantly lower that life expectancy. But if you've got a lot of folks who are making it through young childhood and into young adulthood, they are, of course, then going to live, long, fruitful lives. But that infant mortality rate, which we'll get to, and that childhood death rate can really bring down that life expectancy. And around the world, life expectancy varies. We've got Japan and Singapore in the mid to high 80s. United States, we're not quite to 80, so we're maybe not as high as we should be given the size of our economy. You would expect that the United States would have a higher life expectancy, but we don't. And there's factors and reasons why our life expectancy in the U.S. maybe doesn't match where it should be compared to other nations. And then also, typically speaking, when it comes to men and women, ladies tend to outlive the dudes. And there are some, there's some reasons for that. When you look at life expectancy comparing females to males, and you're wondering why does one group outlive the other? Typically speaking, generally speaking, women tend to take better care of their bodies in terms of health, wellness, and fitness. Thus, they live longer. Women also tend to work less physically demanding jobs. This isn't a shot at them. This is just, on the average. And that helps them live longer. And then a third reason why women tend to live longer, have you ever gone to YouTube and just, watched any video ever on YouTube of dudes doing things like, hey, I've got chainsaws, a flamethrower, and a unicycle. Let's go. Yeah, right? Like we tend to make some poor choices with our life, which is why women tend to outlive men on average, which also helps to explain why. Next time you're cruising around on a Sunday morning and you notice the car with like the one old dude, he's driving and he's got 3 ladies with him, it's not because he's a ladies' man. It's because he's the only one left. All of his male counterparts are dead. So yeah. Anyway, moving on. Enough about the old biddies in the car with the ladies' man. Life expectancy. Let's talk literacy rate. So literacy rate, that is the average age or average number of people. Oh, by the way, we got to kick back to life expectancy. Shoot, my goodness. Let's kick it back to life expectancy. What is a good number for life expectancy? Anything in the mid 70s and above would be a good number for life expectancy. 75 plus, that's a pretty solid number. 73, that's decent as well. But, if we're going to put a pin on it, let's call it 74. That's a good number. Now on to literacy rate. That is the percentage of people over the age of 15 that can read and write. Literate, literature, books, reading, writing. And so what percentage of your population over the age of 15 can read or write? That number, that one can be tricky because I want you to think for a second, what's a good number? What would be a good number? What would be a good literacy rate? I want you to pause the video and write down your guess as to what you think a good number is. Okay, how many of you said a good number would be like 70 plus? How many of you said 80 plus? Right? Because you're thinking, all right, percentages, school grades. Man, if I got a 75 or above on my schoolwork, that's pretty decent. It's a C. It's not an A, but it's pretty decent. Or an 85. Now we're talking B, B plus. That's a good rate. No. For literacy rate, 75, not good. 85, not good. Because think about it. Right? We're talking about what percentage of people can read and write. And imagine for a moment that only 3 out of every 4 adults over the age of 15 could read and write. That means 1 out of 4 can't. So 75% would not be a quote unquote good number for literacy rate. To find a good number, you want something that's like 97 plus, right? You're looking for a literacy rate that's, 95 plus is decent, but 97, 98 plus is what you're shooting for. United States, we're right in that 98, 99 category. And that's really kind of, tops amongst the world. You're never really going to truly hit 100% literacy because that's just math and that's just not how that works. And then our last term here, this one is definitely a darker term to talk about. And it's not always an enjoyable one to talk about. But we're talking about infant mortality rate. And infant mortality rate is the average number of infants that die out of every 1,000 that are born before the age of 1. So if we back this up and talk about how that number is calculated, for every 1,000 children that are born, right? So we're talking about actual births, every 1,000 children that are born, on average, how many of those 1,000 will die before the age of 1? And that number, again, that's not a pleasant number to think about, but it is a way that we can measure levels of development, access to healthcare for the mother during pregnancy and after pregnancy. It's a way to measure access to healthcare for the children while they're in the womb, prior to birth and after birth. And so there's this infant mortality rate can tell us really a lot about access to healthcare in general. And then also, quality of things like sanitation and water and food and nutrition and all of those things. And so in terms of a good number, here, the closer to 0, the better is what we're shooting for. And, really anything under like 5 would be considered a good number. Under 7 would be a good number. And so, as you're looking at these numbers and you come across them, and you see certain numbers and you're wondering what they mean, again, really anything under, 5 or 7, I would say would be considered a good number. And so there, our key terms or our key kind of measures of development: GDP per capita, which helps us measure the economy and the size and the strength of the economy; literacy rate, which takes a look at education, reading and writing; infant mortality rate and life expectancy. Both of those are a way to evaluate and measure health within a country. But those are 4 key terms that you're going to come across quite a bit, not just today and in the days to come, but in the rest of the year. So go back, rewind, rewatch anything that you might have missed, but by now you should have details on all 4 of those. I hope that you are doing well, and I will talk to you later.